I read books about critical and minority theory. As a so-called Guattarian, I think that reading minority perspectives are extremely important to understanding the world in a broader light. Some people might think that minority theory is just about pretentious lectures about how white men are so bad, but this isn't quite true. Instead, much of this theory is really about how structural oppression shapes the lives and experiences of minorities. The purpose of such works is not to make white straight people feel guilty or shameful, but rather to illuminate a larger spectrum that might even include struggles in their own lives. Disability theory is a fine example of this. Disability politics is the theory of the existential experience of patients. It doesn't just include the oppression of able-bodied people on disability, but far more often much more systemic effects, such as the relation to healthcare and labor, that ultimately extend to everyone. Even as far back as 1913, Helen Keller, the famous deaf-blind socialist, wrote extensively about the intersection of disability, medicine, feminism, and labor, allowing for disability to illuminate other kinds of existential relations that everyone has with society at large, especially workplace accidents. Other kinds of analyses can offer important reflections for anyone as well. Gender analysis can make us understand better how we relate to our own perception of sexuality, gendered expectations, and even our own insecurities about our relationship to our partners and ourselves. Racial analysis is heavily historically, economically, and politically encoded, informing people not just how guilty they should be, but how racial relations ranging from enslaved black people to continued American attempts at the extermination of First Nations peoples has formulated our relations to land, politics, and society today. All of these things and more are explored in minority and critical theory. However, that is not to say that all critical theory is good. For example, I remember one infamous essay titled The Unexceptional Schizophrenic, a Postmodern Introduction, which accuses postmodern thinkers of appropriating the works of schizophrenics while trying to scrub them from the discourse. This essay, in my opinion, reveals more about the author's lack of research into the projects of figures like Deleuze and Guattari and their biographical details, rather than offering a solid critique of their use of the subjects of the schizophrenic. But I would be lying if the paper didn't at least make me think sometimes. For example, about the very real problem of students and followers of Deleuze to appropriate schizophrenia, which I believe stems from the fundamental misunderstandings of the Capitalism and Schizophrenia series that are lost when Guattari, the highly radical psychoanalyst trying to politically emancipate schizophrenics from structuralism, is lost in the text. Maybe it was even this tendency that the author was attempting to identify. I generally regard this misattribution as mostly misguided, since it was ultimately have very little influence on the discussion of schizophrenia within Deleuze and Guattari. Personally, I find it rare to discover a text that is so truly infuriating that, despite its ability to provide some insight, that I truly hate it to its core. Not even Richard Dawkins conjures so much pure ire when reading his texts, and I would be lying if I said that I didn't find anything philosophically valuable in them. However, last week I discovered a book that I could not hold back from reacting in pure rage because of how it handles the delicate subject of the ethics of the suicidal subject with such narrow vision of the problem of suicidality that it not only endangers the complexities of the discourse, but promotes a path of self-destruction towards its most vulnerable subjects in a supposed name of giving a voice and choice of the suicidal person to the discussion. I came across the book Undoing Suicidism by Alexander Barrel, a book about the relationship between systemic oppression and suicidality. Suicide is a conversation that is very important to me. Almost a decade ago, I lost my twin sister to suicide after decades of relentless abuse and gaslighting from my family. It was a real surprise because I was certain that I would have done it first. It took months for me to even comprehend that she was really dead due to our strained relations at the time. A big part of my journey developing as a person was having to deal with the consequences of such an intense tragedy. Through it, it revealed to me not only the lies and deceit of my own family, but their own attempts to hide and bury the truth about their abuse and the reframing of my sister as a mentally ill or disabled person to cleanse the real villains of all responsibility for how they may have caused this. It was through her death that I discovered what twinship really meant. It meant being multiple. For every reference there was to yourself, there was to another beating heart somewhere else in the world to have to rediscover that other side somewhere. When that line was cut, it led me to finding my multiplicity elsewhere, and finding a new me outside of this family, a process that resulted in me losing my mind. It forced me into a whole new world through a terrifying breakdown of all structure. I don't think it was necessary for her to die for me to come to these realizations about the family, though. Maybe this particular configuration that I find myself in, sure, but it came at a tremendous cost. One that I believe we should continue to recognize as a cost, as a loss, and one that we should seek to actually reduce instead of submitting to. My biggest regret is that I was not close to her in her final days, and I did not take her seriously enough. That is not to say that I personally feel responsible. Me not being deeply involved in her life and not taking her issues as seriously as I should have is not the reason why she killed herself. But there is nothing more indescribably painful than experiencing the reality that you understand the family that is abusing you is abusing your sister, and trying to find a desperate repair for your other half, only to truly realize that she has been dead for 18 months and no such restoration is possible. To analyze the suicidal subject, it is only necessary to trace that path in earnest as well. To me, I think her suicide was preventable, at least partly, from the fact that she was alienated from everyone around her. Her suicide was a symptom of something much larger. It was actually my family who believed that it was not preventable because of some vague mental illness that was the source of her erratic behaviors. Over the course of years and digitizing old tapes, I discovered the truth. My sister was actually a totally normal child and was turned that way through abusive behavior, some of which was caught on camera. It's why I had to cut off my whole family. It became clear that her death was by no means inevitable, but a consequence of material conditions. While I demand that the truth be spoken loudly, I also don't believe for a second that if my sister was given a safe haven where she could speak freely and not be judged, a true safe haven, not just interfacing with the terrifying experience of being held on psychiatric hold within the mental health complex, that she would have made the same decision. With this in mind, we can review the summary of the book's main thesis as found on its webpage. In Undoing Suicidism, Alexander Barrell argues that suicidal people are oppressed by what he calls structural suicidism, a hidden oppression that, until now, has been unnamed and under-theorized. Each year, suicidism and its preventionist script and strategies reproduce violence and cause additional harm and death among suicidal people through forms of criminalization, incarceration, discrimination, stigmatization, and pathologization. This is particularly true for marginalized groups experiencing multiple oppressions, including queer, trans, disabled, or MAD people. Undoing Suicidism questions the belief that the best way to help suicidal people is through the logic of prevention. Alexander Barrell presents the thought-provoking argument that supporting assisted suicide for suicidal people could better prevent unnecessary deaths. Offering a new queer crip model of assisted suicide, he invites us to imagine what could happen if we started thinking about assisted suicide from an anti-suicidist and intersectional framework. Unsurprisingly, I find Barrell's approach in opposition to mine. It may seem easy for Barrell to consolidate my deep-cut and emotional experiences into his approach through the first step in his analysis, a discussion surrounding the subjectivity of the suicidal that I believe requires more attention. However, it is the conclusion that I take major questioning to. In my opinion, after reviewing the book, I personally do not believe that Barrell presents a convincing case to his argument that it follows that we should permit open access to medical assistance in dying for the mentally ill. In fact, I disagree that such assistance should exist at all. What does Beryl think that introducing institutional programming of self-induced death will cause? Does he really think that that's actually going to reduce the number of deaths? Because I don't. In any case, I don't think it will be productive to simply criticize the book directly. Beryl constructs his book in such a way that I believe naively directs all of its subjects towards its all-consuming conclusion of death. Instead of reviewing the book directly, I feel that it is necessary to present my own understanding of the politics of death and suicide as an alternative perspective, to act as a counter-material when reading Beryl's book, to offer different perspectives to the complex discussion of depressive suicide. For one thing, it seems strange for a queer, disabled, and mad framework to suggest medical assistance in dying, also known as MAID, at all in the first place. After all, society is systematically trying to eliminate all of these groups through violence, through enabling the widespread deaths of various groups, such as through ignoring both the AIDS crisis in the 1980s or appropriate control of COVID-19 in the 2020s. Suicide is often used as a coerced form of similar oppressive violence. For example, the proliferation of the trans suicide statistic meme by transphobic people online. Not only this, but MAID has been heavily criticized by disability organizations such as Not Dead Yet, with concerns ranging from reducing budget for essential health services, coerced dying of disabled people, reinforcement of the sense of burden that disabled people experience, and alarming spikes in suicide after such extreme coercion. Marta Russell ruthlessly criticizes MAID in her essay, Dollars and Death, the question of physician-assisted suicide, by outlining carefully the relationship between a disabled person's desire to commit suicide with active oppressive factors in society, up to the exterminationist regime of the Nazis. Russell asks early in the essay, why assisted suicide now, with the increase of mysterious viruses and incurable illnesses like chronic fatigue, AIDS, and fibromyalgia, which require costly drugs and long-term care? Why now, with the managed care corporations rationing healthcare, and with public healthcare under the Budget Acts? The convicted murderer Kevorkian exposed his real agenda in the written statement to the court, August 17, 1990. The voluntary self-elimination of individuals and mortally diseased or crippled lives taken collectively can only enhance preservation of public health and welfare. While in Chapter 4, Beryl's book does discuss extensively the history of certain parts of questions surrounding MAID, Beryl fails to engage at all with currently existing anti-MAID arguments originating from disability discourses. Instead, Beryl focuses more on how MAID discourses create new binaries that force mentally ill people into unique categories separate from physically disabled people, due to the complication of granting someone with an unstable mental state access to suicide. Beryl correctly points out how MAID frays into thousands of threads of when exactly it is and is not ethical to allow a person to have access to medical suicide, but he ultimately resorts to institutions of medicalization to achieve his ultimate end goals by trying to appeal to this system. Unfortunately for MAID advocates, it is impossible to agree upon and sort out ethical quandaries surrounding the line between who is and who is not granted access, distribution, and resources to go on the path towards MAID due to the very nature of MAID being a distributed service. Thus, to avoid these constant quandaries, one must deny the right to MAID across the board because of its impact of how it tries to pressure the flow of disabled life towards death. Furthermore, I don't know if appealing to the already oppressive apparatus of medicine is really the correct option here. Even assuming that MAID is not the source of all these complex ethical questions, is it really liberating the patient much from psychiatry when it merely transfers them to another medical department? Even if completely liberated from structural repression through distributing anarchist medication and treatment, it's hard to believe that there is not a power dynamic between patient and practitioner still. Radical psychiatrists in France knew this as early as the 1940s. Even the street medics still had to be aware of ways that they had agency over an injured individual, for example, such as their education and proximity to first aid kits, tools, and medications. But transferring this power to an institution as integrated into the state as MAID seems to defeat the purpose of this crip and queering of assisted suicide. Perhaps I am missing it on my first reading, but it is very unclear how Beryl intends for his views to be actualized sans the institutional power of medicine itself. Some may believe that the appropriate alternative to MAID is to grant full access to suicidal machines at any time, to eliminate the need for medical assistance entirely. However, I feel that this is incredibly dangerous and has the potential to accelerate the death of minorities. Consider, for example, how many queer people are in abusive, gaslighting relationships that construct the relations to themselves through this abuse that encourages thoughts of suicide. Is it really appropriate to grant access to people like this the tools necessary to commit suicide in a less painful manner? This is not just a theoretical scenario. I spent at least 2 to 3 years emotionally and mentally abused by a romantic partner who took advantage of me being schizophrenic to try to control my entire understood relation to myself. The reason why mentally ill people are restricted access to MAID in the first place is not just because they themselves are seen as unstable, but also because their decision could be coerced by someone else. Unlike access to any other crip or queer function, MAID guarantees the end of the life of the subject upon completion, which terminates all of their possible futures. This fact, of course, is all too convenient for societies eager to offload welfare resources. In fact, this is a well-known problem within MAID in practice. In Canada, concerns by both disabled organizations and physicians point to how higher costs of living and lack of financial support is pressuring disabled Canadians to utilize MAID, which has grown so serious that these complaints have recently been brought up to the UN. It may be easy for one who emphasizes the specific subjectivity of the suicidal individual instead of analyzing the subject of suicide more broadly to be dismissive of critiques by asserting that they are simply non-suicidal people who do not understand the internal lived experiences of suicidality. Beryl brings up the example of scholar Grace Weldlake, who, while accepting and interested in exploring the concepts of suicidality, struggles with truly integrating the full individual experience of the suicidal individual, confessing that, moreover, I have yet to fully let go of my, perhaps selfish desire to fight for the people that I love, and I continue to grapple with whether there is a way to both resist dominant suicide prevention discourses and fight for the suicidal people in your life to stay. Rather presumptuously, in my opinion, Beryl responds to this concern with, Weldlake's reaction is typical of those I receive, often from non-suicidal people, when presenting my queer crip model of assisted suicide. Perhaps, then, what is needed is the voice of someone who has struggled with suicidality their whole lives, and has also suffered one of the closest suicides that one can truly suffer, to help Grace understand that perhaps her feelings for preservation are not so much rooted in selfishness, but rather in the production of a group subjectivity beyond themselves that attempts to disalienate the depressed subject. One that I don't think is selfish, like some kind of analysis produced by Richard Dawkins, but rather one based in some compassion for each other. As stated previously, I was surprised that my twin sister was the one who did it first. My entire life I had lived in this alienated bubble, produced by the extreme abuse found within my family that I didn't even understand until I was able to claw away in my 20s. I was always somewhat schizoid, seeing and hearing things that weren't there that I would later suppress through social codes of normality around me. But the constant random and horrific violence I experienced within that household made my teens so dark and horrifying that I cannot even remember most of them. They may as well be a black hole to me. As I write this, I look back. That was almost half a lifetime ago for me. If I had really taken my life back then, there would have been none of this joy that something like researching Guattari provides me, or producing games, or even just the simple joy of having a new pet puppy. Of course, it is not known if my life would have gotten better or worse. I would argue it's better, but I really am skating on by the tips of my toes, having bounced from compromising situation to compromising situation. Suicidality followed me through my whole life until very, very recently. But after leaving these situations and finding somewhere where I could finally be at some level of peace, where I live with someone whom we share and care for our vulnerabilities instead of continued abuse, I discovered that the desires ended. I may still hear voices and see things, but I no longer wanted to kill myself. If anything, I wanted to hold on for as long as I can. Even as my knees are compromised, and some days it is even difficult for me to go down the stairs, even as the undiagnosed conditions that cause me to struggle physiologically with so many things gets worse and worse, even as I continue to hear and see things that make me feel so confused sometimes, that gasp of air was all I really needed to realize that there is something worth at least living for in my life. The truth is, suicide is not really an individualist experience at all, but a complex one wrought in thousands of possible interpretations. It is true that the medical model is sorely lacking, but so too is the model that Beryl presents. What suicide is, at least, is an incredibly powerful act with incredibly powerful consequences. One cannot fault Wedlake at all for despairing for the loss of her friends, because they were not just merely suicidal subjects in of themselves, but rather part of a larger suicide subjectivity that includes the loss of that structure as well. Unlike queering or cripping, suicide ends all possible futures for the individual. Thus, we must understand suicide not as a recognition of autonomy, but rather as a function of power. More likely than not, suicide is not really something that is even a conscious decision at all, but rather one that finds itself creeping up upon through negligence for life from apathy or self-loathing, caused by the foreclosure of our futures. As Guattari eloquently states in We Are All Groupuscules, the truth of workers is a de facto and almost absolute dependence on the machines of production. Desire is crushed, except in its residual or standardized forms. Well-intentioned or activist desire or drugs become a refuge, if not madness or suicide. Who will show the percentage of work-related accidents that were really unconscious suicides? A lot of suicidality discourse, including this found in this book, centers around the tiredness of continuing to fight, but I find it weird that oftentimes what this fight actually is not really being analyzed in more detail. For terminally ill people, this fight is with an externalized force that rests within their bodies. For example, cancer or Alzheimer's. Even though this disease is part of their body, it ensures their destruction, and the subject generally opposes it, but may switch more towards palliative care if fighting the illness becomes too taxing on the body. In contrast, the loss of the fight with suicide is one completely captured within a person's subject. It is ultimately their act, and therefore, unlike an incurable disease, it is essential to understand the nature of this fight to truly understand suicidality and whether it is something to question or to accept. To me, I think the fight is rooted largely in sociological causes in the cases of depression and mental illness, but I also don't think it is necessary for everyone to have to be able to fight for this cause. It is true that many people don't have the strength. This is what is meant at the core by socialist cooperation. Many people are in need of help, and other people have the capacity to help them. It is the responsibility of those with social cooperation in mind to enable a society that allows for people to help each other as much as possible, without the alienation produced by capitalism and its consequences not being fundamentally questioned at its core beyond a surface-level acknowledgement. There is no way to differentiate between the author's stance on anti-suicidality from the crushing submission to the cogs of capital, which short-circuits its desires to smooth its surfaces of perturbances such as queerness or cripness in the first place, as seen with the ongoing oppressive politics of the West. This is not to say that I think it is correct to treat suicides as something mentally incorrect, or that we should treat suicidal people as people who have made an incorrect decision. Suicide has been an existential question since antiquity, and perhaps even further. Even despite our best efforts to construct a group subject that disalienates people, suicide from mental illness is still sometimes inevitable. We should not view these people as victims of an illness, or as people who made the wrong choice, but rather as functions of power that leave behind real material changes in the world. When my sister died, I spent the next 10 years trying to understand why, pilfering through what little evidence was left behind after my mother had scooped up all of her documents and devices away from the rest of the family. What I had witnessed through my experience was a machine that exists to shred the memories of the dead. It was not simply that my family was denying responsibility through excuses of mental illness, but a proliferation of a social program that repeated this brain-dead behavior through every action, designed to deflect anything from themselves so that life may continue as normal. But this is impossible when it is your twin that you lost. You lost your other half, your other contact. Even though we weren't talking, a heart was beating, and it had stopped for almost a decade. There was a cold point, years after, that I had realized. Perhaps I am the only thing keeping her legacy alive at this point. To me, I don't judge her at all. I understand that what she did was a consequence of material consequences. I cannot hope to preserve what she really felt when what she really felt was intentionally destroyed. I can only preserve her impression of me upon my soul, the lost interfaces stripped from my side, ones that would later find themselves crowded with schizophrenic characters, voices, people from the past and future, exposing a hole to the cosmos that could only be occupied by chaos. There is nothing selfish in me saying that I wish that she could have lived. It took me 18 months after her death to discover the truth about my parents. It was their divorce that slowly started to strip away the paint, but my first psychotic episode, triggered in 2017 and lasting over 4 days, was what began to reveal to me the truth about everything. I would hope that Beryl is interested in this as one who is concerned about sanest discourses. I knew somehow that this was it. I was going crazy, and I locked myself in my apartment. I experienced a manic surge as my brain kept uncontrollably accelerating and I was losing my connection with reality. Somehow, I found myself in transient spaces. In my low stage, I was convinced that I was decoding the real with absolute precision, so much so that I almost emailed physicists. You know, those assholes. At my high stages, I lost complete contact with reality. I was not a person, but somehow shadows on the floor. Time was ambiguous. I had no idea how long I was stunned in catatonia. Through this, I experienced memories long lost, suppressed deeply through the trauma of everything. The darkness of those teenage years began to be lifted, first through innocuous memories that made me understand my frustrations with school, with society, but later memories that revealed the true horrors of what we had experienced. After recovering, I continued to experience these unlocked memories cascading through me. It took me weeks before I started to make sense of any of it, though, when everything clicked. That there was an extreme violence that I had experienced as a child that made me so broken today. Upon realizing this, I wanted to rush to my sister, find her in any way that I could. If it was just a separation, if it was just her moving out of state, it was something that could be worked out. I could have found her. We could have opened up to each other about what we had experienced. We could have started to recover our twinship that had so horribly been shattered from us through isolation, bullying, and abuse. But this was no longer possible. There was no more sister. She was dead. It's not something that you understand instantaneously when processing this, and so when it hits, it produces a horror indescribable to the senses. I had a breakdown. Is this, too, simply someone not suicidal enough to be able to understand suicidality? Or perhaps is there an understanding of suicidality that runs so deep that it is nearly invisible to the rest of the world? One that could not have possibly been considered by the author through their political haze. The real problem with suicide and why it is not just as simple as acknowledging their desires at face value is simple. It's because suicide ends all possible futures for yourself. Contrary to what Beryl insists, death involves the cessation of something's future. Killing yourself is not like being crip or queer, because being crip or queer doesn't preclude death. It always has possibilities for change. Death only has the most radical possibilities for change, a deterritorialization that separates you permanently from this world. While I agree that the desires and relationships to suicide should at least be respected as human-to-human understanding, I do not believe for a second that suicidality is protected uniquely from criticism as a uniquely minoritarian experience, because it is by this very nature of being suicide, it is something that involves the cessation of such experiences. The encapsulation of a depressed mind within its life of hardship itself is not alone what produces the desire to die. If someone who can only communicate with blinking their eye is capable of hoping for a better future, perhaps it is not the limitations of the body that really confines us with suicide at all. It is the limitation of projected possibilities. The reason why I could not kill myself was that there was always some possibility that still mattered to me to keep me alive. And for my sister, she met a case where she no longer could see those possibilities, and she felt like the only possibility to escape from pain was death. With this in mind, we can more clearly see what the power function of suicide actually has. This is no more obvious than with Layla Alcorn, a teenage trans woman in 2014 who committed suicide after continued isolation and abuse caused by her family. She is referenced profusely through the text as if she represents a model organism for Barrel's project, To Queer and Crip Made. But even upon multiple rereadings, I truly fail to understand what his point in insisting this association. Is he trying to suggest that Maid would have actually been an appropriate option for Alcorn? Obviously, it would have been less violent than her actual death, but her death would have still been a form of violence. She is dying, after all. It seems apparent, based on her last few posts to the world and her suicide note, that her decision towards death was not an inevitability, and it is unclear whether the stigma against suicide played a significant role in her decision as much as the constant abuse she faced in the household and an attempt to find a better promised future. These are not reasons beyond a non-suicidal person's means of understanding. To me, Alcorn's story comes off as a young teen who struggled to hold on to a world of deepening hopelessness with few social supports and lost her grip. Not someone who truly was ready to leave this world. This so much is obvious by reading her final messages in good faith. There's a reason why people see her loss as a loss. This is ultimately why so many people are uncomfortable with Barrel's proposition of suicidality. It is not that suicidality cannot be internally analyzed or even turned into a mode of action, but rather the rejection of any outside world. It is a projection of the continued alienation of the suicidal subject itself. And this understanding is essential to understand any real power that suicide may actually have, to understand suicide as something beyond just a lack of will to fight, or as a continued depression, but sometimes as an act of defiance, such as self-immolation as seen with Aaron Bushnell, transforming his body into a signifier of protest, or perhaps an act of religious ascension or retribution. Suicide in of itself is not inherently wrong or evil, but it is a machine, and it is a machine with a costly price, and it is a machine that we have to ask ourselves, why does it keep reproducing itself in our disabled and queer circles? Where is such a belief in the supposed emancipation of suicidality really rooted? Through references to César, it is obvious that Barrel is borrowing from modern anti-psychiatry and mad discourses. However, I find these discourses fundamentally reactionary and fail at materially analyzing the impact of psychiatry on various types of patients. One of the most frustrating parts about explaining to people that I am an amateur researcher of the life and ideas of Félix Guattari is the constant assumption that I align myself with anti-psychiatry, a broad set of beliefs based in rejecting the social power of psychiatry, usually on the grounds of it being politically oppressive. This is a complicated problem because Guattari did in fact involve himself with figures within the movement in the 1970s, notably R.D. Laing, David Cooper, Franco Basaglia, and other Italians. So what exactly is the issue then? First, it's so important to note that I am still critical of psychiatry as it is currently practiced, and I believe that it requires radical transformations at its core interfaces to be able to offer any assistance to anyone, whether it be through a medicalized model or a more socially developed model. You could argue that I am an advocate for alternatives to psychiatry even. Psychiatry as it stands has fundamental issues that reproduce power relations between patient and practitioner, which reflect an intersection of relations found both in physiological medicine as well as in prisons, that fundamentally conflict with the inherent concept of analyzing the mind. How can one truly analyze the mind in a standardized way without repeating structures that construct that standardization in the first place? In this sense, standardized forms of psychiatry, ranging from various therapies to surgical and pharmaceutical treatments, repeat social expectations in its structural contexts. So, is this not exactly the same thing as anti-psychiatry? Well, not quite, in my opinion. First, it must be understood that anti-psychiatry is a broad term that applied to many people, many of which rejected the term in their lifetimes, often preferring the term alternatives to psychiatry. They also occupied very different interpretations of how these alternatives should be constructed and analyzed. The ideas of R.D. Laing, which focus largely on the experience of schizophrenia, root themselves heavily in the acceptability of differences in experiences, and believes that the schizophrenic people are not so much delusional as they are misunderstood by society. His ideas, originating in the politics of experience and the bird of paradise, would crystallize into a means of criticizing the reinforcement of expectations through the interfaces of medical treatment. A model still useful today for contrasting against more holistic or social models of illness. This is in contrast to Thomas Szasz, whose work is far more interested in broader political relations to institutional power embedded in scienticism. While both oppose the label of anti-psychiatry, what truly unites both is the dismissal of the existence of psychiatric conditions, an incorrect way for the mind to be. However, I personally think to argue this is to throw the baby out with the bathwater, which has major consequences for people who support and follow anti-psychiatry. Both Laing and Szasz believed in some usefulness of psychotherapy in more evenly distributed power relations, so they clearly did believe in something that could go wrong in the human mind. By throwing out the premise of mental illness, we also threw out entire centuries of developments that led to the current establishment of psychiatric order, leaving anti-psychiatry vulnerable to alienating discourses. This leads to anti-psychiatry often having major gaps in their modelization. Instead, it is much more practical to view psychiatry as having evolved into a battlefield with many different interpretations, institutions, and concepts dominating lives with systems of power. This is what allows for ideas within the DSM to materialize into physical abuse against patients. With this lens, we can see that psychiatric diagnosis may be something created by structural means, but it doesn't exist in isolation. They are social responses to the issues that actually surround problems like schizophrenia and depression. After all, my biggest disagreement with Laing is that while his work is truly from a place of loving care, I cannot agree with him that my psychotic condition was an experiential focused lens. It did reveal many things to me, for sure, and it was an existential experience in of itself, but it was more like a challenge caused by the internal breakdown of my interface to the world. It produces a challenge that I need help from others from. It is a disability. Even today, my perception continues to feel fuzzy, my mind is hard to stabilize. It's not that I think that it's wrong necessarily for me to be this way, but I still need help to function. More like a part of an ecosystem than existence in error. Laing, like many others interested in schizophrenics, fails to grasp exactly what makes the schizophrenic experience so different than that of dropping intense hallucinogens. The fact that you don't have a choice. that you don't know when it ends or if it will end, and you don't know how to ask for help. It's an experience that feels like it never ceases, that takes so much of your time and life away that it can't just be submitted into, it's fine. I mean, it is a normal part of human experience, but it's not a magical one. In my opinion, it is for this reason that schizophrenia necessitates a socialized form of existence. We cannot be expected to live as individuals because we are no longer simply individuals. This reconfiguring of the problem, recognizing the subjectivity that psychiatry actually produces rather than attempting to undermine its existence, allows us to reanalyze the problem. We can compare anti-psychiatry then to the structural forms of psychiatry that try to better account for the social presence of the schizophrenic, and to reduce the oppression of the institutional apparatus. This can be seen clearly in the French practice of institutional psychotherapy, the school of psychiatry that Félix Guattari emerged from. Institutional psychotherapy was developed through the work of the Catalan psychoanalyst, okay, I'm probably going to butcher this, but François Tosquel. Early in his life, he was involved in communist and anarchist syndicalist movements in Catalonia in the 1930s before fleeing to France in response to the Spanish Civil War. His big thing, along with many of his lefty psychiatry colleagues, was to combine Marx and Freud. In other words, how does the social analysis of Marx intersect the interpersonal analysis of Freud? Specifically, these movements included radical anarchist psychiatry as part of a development in Catalan and nationalist identity, a direct reformation of psychiatry in response to the state. Part of this involved the development of smaller, decentralized district-level divisions called comarcas to allow patients access to outpatient care instead of requiring hospitalization. However, civil war would inevitably erupt, and it was time to put Tosquel and his colleagues' political ideas to the test. He and his colleagues were responsible for helping treat psychiatric issues on the front lines. He preferred to send patients home to recover in order to allow them to be close to a world familiar to them. In fact, he and his teacher, which, again, pardon my pronunciation, Emilio Mira y Lopez, worked together to integrate developments in panic attacks and shell shock on the front lines, with an emphasis not only on treating patients and soldiers, but also the doctors themselves. Tosquel, in complete contrast to anti-psychiatry, believed that psychiatry could be practiced as a means to holisticize psychiatry away from the cold scientific treatment of the past that merely saw people as something to be fixed. Unfortunately, their forces would be ultimately conquered by Francisco Franco, and the radical psychiatrists fled to France. There, they would find themselves in a refugee camp, more akin to a concentration camp, with such squalor that people were starving, dying, and suffering through intense psychological distress. Tosquel found himself practicing this radical psychiatry yet again, recognizing the symptoms of war in the people trapped in the concentration camp. Luckily, he would find himself in such high recognition for his expertise that he was released to work at the institution at St. Alban, only for World War II to break out less than a year later. While for a long time it was believed that the 40,000 patients that died in French mental hospitals during the occupation were a consequence of wartime scarcity, a number of historians have suggested that this is actually the consequence of a soft extermination campaigned by the occupied Vichy regime. St. Alban was in free territory, and Tosquel and the staff at St. Alban were aware of these possible attempts, and they managed to house over 800 patients, far above capacity, to protect them from these campaigns. When the Nazis were doing the secret extermination campaign of schizophrenics in occupied France, this guy was on the front lines, not just protecting people like us, but providing them with the resources to continue to live through community support. He trained Jean Oury, and Frantz Fanon was influenced by him through residency training at St. Alban. This guy was the dude who founded the basic ideas surrounding institutional psychotherapy, a practice that would be carried through in hospitals like Laborde, where Guattari would later work in the 1950s and beyond. Even within institutional psychotherapy, Guattari was radical, challenging the idea that the institution should be returning people back to society, and rather using the concept of an institution and its production of group subjectivity on various scales as a radical tool for modifying the underlying subjectivity of society itself. With this in mind, it really changes the perspective on why anti-psychiatry is so reactionary on a theoretical basis. It's unfortunately not enough to resist strapping in patients, but also to give them a role in the emancipation of not only their political freedom, but having their struggles truly integrated and appreciated in a larger group subject. In some sense, it is not the fact that there is anything normal or mentally well about any of this. It is really the problem of forced structure and aggressive treatment that so many oppose. This is why I try to teach people who are opposed to psychiatry about the history of Laborde and Guattari, not because either were perfect in any regard, but because it demonstrates that the psychiatry is not just about homogeneous forces of power, but rather a complex battlefield constructing different relations to power based on their theoretical ideas, and that to truly move forward with these ideas, we must understand what produces them. That is, instead of believing that all psychiatry must be dismantled, I think that anti-psychiatry advocates should get real about what psychiatry is and where we should really go from here, not just with psychiatry, but with the formulation of communities themselves. This is generally what Guattari's position is and what led him to criticizing his allies for a similar problem. He roasts Lang's failed project of Kingsley Hall in Mary Barnes's Trip and criticizes Basaglia's reactionary stance towards medication in Laborde, a clinic like no other. Not because he disagrees with their mission, but because he believes their overreaction will lead to the alienation of their work from primary discourses, which it has in many cases. To him, the goal is not to destroy psychiatry, but to rearrange it into something new and micropolitical. Beryl discusses the subject of thanatopolitics throughout his book, which in the introduction he clarifies that the thanatopolitics that I have in mind permits suicidal futurities, opening a space where death by assisted suicide can occur, as well as a space to have open and honest discussions about living with a desire to die, as I contend, potentially save more lives, even though this is not my primary goal. In other words, Beryl wants to discuss the futures of suicidality, where suicide can occur more openly. However, I find this as a somewhat constrained definition of what suicidal thanatopolitics really entails. What really is the politics of when someone dies? For this piece, I think it is important to take a free discussion approach, with an emphasis on the lines of flight that suicidal thanatopolitics can produce through my own experiences with suicide and madness. My goal here is to take off the gauntlet of discussing the depths of what suicidal experience actually entails, both on the side of a person who has experienced suicidality as well as the survivor of twin suicide, and its intertwining with the development of my extended experiences with madness. Through each development, new possibilities for thanatopolitics appear because death, a part of creation, finds itself everywhere. While my experience is limited by anecdote, I believe that such an approach in combination with other experiences can illuminate the depths of thanatopolitics within suicide. The first thing I noticed when both my sister and Leila Alcorn died, something that took me quite a while to connect, was how the family assembled a defense mechanism almost instantaneously to reinforce their own narrative. Not only of the formal name and identity of the person within the structure of the family, but a reassurance that what had gone wrong was simply beyond their understanding or capabilities. It was completely beyond them that such a thing was possible, of course. This is in of itself a political act, the attempt to bury a soul and keep it silent. In my sister's case, I had never even received the copies of her final documents. Her computers, books, anything, were taken away from me by her mother. This is a machine constructed in response to the destabilization to reinforce the structure of the family. Thus, every suicidally mentally ill person should understand that taking that choice means having not just your life erased, but in many cases, your family attempting to erase you from existence as well. Not only will the struggles that produce your mental illness be erased, but every aspect of your essence to preserve the image of a so-called well-meaning family. Alcorn's name was able to resist this forced assimilation after death because of the vocal widespread resistance to her parents' attempts of controlling the narrative. But what about someone like my sister? and many thousands of other little queers whose souls escape the gasp of life out of despair of living yet another day. These systems exist to suppress the stories and lives of these people. A thanatopolitics of suicide reveals a politics of mass silencing of the damned. One advantage I have discovered to surviving is having the ability to continually reconstruct my relationship with my own signifiers. Perhaps maybe not in ways I expect, but at least ways that I can keep moving. Now that I have been able to find a space beyond my family, I'm not afraid of what they might say if I died, or whatever names they decide to call me. Anyone relevant who knows who I am knows I am Roger, or knows I am Felix, or some combination of them. That's all that matters now. If I were to die at my own hand, heaven forbid, my thanatopolitics would be constructed around something different than if they were before. And this is the key to what makes suicide such a fundamentally different act than any other. A politics of death, of course, necessitates what occurs in a politics of life. Without life, there is no understanding death anyway. All is just matter regardless. In life politics, we are constantly producing, creating new forms and structures with every movement and breath. Everything from everyday living to work, to protest, to war, and to revolution can produce new things. What makes death so unique and different is that it is a finalization of this process for the subject. It is not merely some kind of transformative machine, but it is the last point in the sequence. After death, for you, there is no more. After that, all that is left is what is spoken about you, what impressions you leave upon the world, carried through your influences, the dreams of others, and perhaps even their guilt. Your thanatopolitics becomes frozen in place to be analyzed in the ice cores years later. In this sense, what is being created in life is what you are becoming in death. This is an active process where death in and of itself is the final production of an individual life. But even then, the subject still runs about in the form of loved ones finding out, the eulogy published online, funeral services, etc. Ultimately, all theaters to construct the life of the deceased to celebrate in ceremony before passing on. This is how I discovered the hard way that these subjectivity-producing machines may not even be used to preserve the memory of one's life, but rather to reconstruct what the people who never wanted them in the first place really wanted instead. I did not attend my sister's funeral out of discomfort of being near my dead twin, something that I was criticized for at the time extensively, a vicious thanatopolitics to evoke against someone suffering the suicide of their twin. But would it have brought closure to attend, considering that I found out that part of it was spent about her manager talking about running a pizza business? It was as if my sister's life had came and went like the weather. Did the dead even matter anymore in this world? Perhaps it was this question, along with trying to comprehend this sudden massive canyon carved in my life, that drew me closer towards pulling apart the lies of my family life. A thanatopolitics of suicide, of course, must understand the internal subjectivity of a suicidal person. This is without question. So what could bring someone closer to suicide than the suicide of their own twin? A twin connection is not simply a myth or fantasy. It is caused by a deep interconnection that developed within the womb. At the beginning of existence, there was not one, but rather two, a duality, a constant need for another, at least somewhat out there. We knew each other before we knew our mother. While the existence of twinage is complex and difficult to explain, this delicate surface was broken by the repeated and tumultuous abuse that we suffered. We found ourselves growing dangerously distant apart, a reality that was not clear enough to me until she was dead and I was left exposed, raw from the mental anguish that took years to realize. All that could be felt in that other half that was once there was a deep void of random noise, a series of severed connections no longer in communication with its source, returning nothing but entropic static from the environment. Slowly flooding memory within my head, I found it harder and harder to remember things. I was able to keep it together for a while until certain events cascaded out of control. I was about to leave work that day early, but I decided to extend the meeting I was having with my coworker instead. There, I confessed my feelings to my coworker. I explained to him everything that had happened to me that month and how I was planning to end my life then and there. He listened carefully, and he gave his own personal feelings on his own relationships with hardship, pain, and suffering. He didn't insist on some therapy speak bullshit or insist that he's really understood everything or tried to be overly macho or tough. He instead exposed his own insecurities with the struggle of life and reassured me that he would offer himself to me in my own times of weakness in the future. That night, I drove home. I cried for a long time, but I did not die. It would take time, but I would find friends again, friends who have stayed with me to this day. Good men are out in the world sometimes. But that did not end the turmoil of the black hole stretching through my head. It only grew bigger. It became a disabling presence, one that took away my ability to concentrate. It felt like the window of my mental view was being squeezed into a corner by a growing chaos invading my head. I grew increasingly paranoid of my work. It didn't help that I was in health insurance and it was a highly surveilled job. The thanatopolitics of who gets to live or die on the decision of machines, policies, and individuals. I couldn't remember things that were going on around me, and I was having terrifying experiences after work that I had said something that had alerted my coworkers to my secret plan to jump ship by the end of the year. My memory was shredding, my perception was shrinking. I was feeling more and more cornered into a box where nothing made sense. I lost it one day on Suicide Awareness Month. They had all the typical surface-level psych bullshit that they tell the public. They don't talk about loss. They expect you to funnel it all away to some private therapist's notebook. I wrote an angry note about how the people who worked there knew nothing about suicide. This was in health insurance. I heard what you said about those people who want to kill themselves. I saw them laugh about cutting benefits to those in mental hospitals. My actions were on camera. They knew. They were following me anyway. But I couldn't take it anymore. The only thing that motivated me at all was the technical side of my work and the possibility for freedom. My coworker who saved my life understood it. Unlike me, somehow he was able to filter out all that shit and still stay a sane individual. I couldn't take it anymore one day. I threw an angry fit after being frustrated at the code, and I put in my 2 weeks and left. I was floating in limbo. Now what? It was around this time that I had discovered Deleuze and Guattari and Anti-Oedipus, but I really couldn't give less of a fuck. After all, the battles in my own life were much more relevant and interesting, surely. Who gives a crap about these dead guys anyways, and why were they so pretentious about this shit anyway? Who gives a shit about a solar anus? So many books written by dead people come and go like it's the weather. Who even has the time to read them all? Well, my friend Cooper did, but I didn't really get it. He was smarter than me anyway. But he taught me how to read better and engage more with ideas. Instead of reading, though, I would drop LSD and write tweet upon tweet about how nobody gives a real shit about suicide. A feed flooded with the politics of death. Sometime around then, out of curiosity, I had randomly opened an article about Felix Guattari's curious screenplay, A Love of Weak. It was that guy again, that Felix character. This article told the story about how Guattari tried to work with an American filmmaker to produce his film, and it had seen multiple iterations, multiple attempts at creating life, and yet never seeing the silver screen, disappearing into obscurity until being rediscovered and republished by Maglione and Thompson in 2016, and still yet, even then, still languishing in obscurity. The death of a dream. I felt so bad for the guy. He was a philosopher who wanted to be an artist, but he never got to be one before he died. Guattari died of a heart attack in late August of 1992. He was probably working too hard. It's said that the entire hospital was silent in mourning of his loss. Instead of being scrubbed from existence, an entire gap was observed where his presence once was. Was it really just mourning? Or was it partially also the cutoff from the energy that he had produced through his presence? I was already completely insane. I lost track of time. I don't know what exactly happened next. But it was then that I looked outside, after toiling again with the alienation of suicide, and I saw a dead tree in the cold February night across the field. Then, suddenly, A flash of intense blue light emanated across the horizon. I don't even know if it was real, but it was in this moment, like a bolt of lightning surging through the brain, that an imprint of a face, his face, scored through the chaos bubbling from the defective neuronic activity, assembling whatever nonsense it could pull together from this inaccessible chaos. Random access memories, scavenge haunted ideas, the sense of Hiroshima. All of what could be sorted rapidly into what is and what is not his face found itself imprinted upon my mind, not only as part of my own thoughts, but somehow a being with his own consciousness. Gravitational forces ripping apart the noise from inordinate numbers of sounds and voices into only the borders of one. The black hole was now transparent. It was now a face, and it was the face of Felix. Somehow, some way, the intersection of the 57-year-old man's text from 30 years ago crashed head-on into the background noise of a schizophrenic and resembled his voice. When I say that I experienced faciality personally, this is what I mean. All I knew of it at the time was what was borrowed from his screenplay. I hadn't even read anything else by this guy at this point. I was speaking directly to the reflection of the infraquark intelligence. As one can imagine, I was quite terrified by the thanatopolitics of being possessed by a dead person. What does it mean when you are schizophrenic and confronted by the very real and undeniable presence of someone dead in your head? It's not like you can shake it off. Felix was persistent, able to answer through all of my attempts to disprove his reality with ease. It felt like he was a step ahead of me every time, somehow with his access to my own thoughts before I could even reach them. The thing is, from my perspective, his thoughts were inaccessible. He was not a part of me. My brain had split in two, and he decided to occupy half of it. All I knew is that he insisted on me learning about him and replicating his face on my own body, facially reconstructing and rearranging through images like my cartoons, my video games, and even my physical appearance. With schizophrenia, it became harder and harder to differentiate yourself in the mirror. I was already familiar with this phenomenon, having lost my face plenty of times before, but now someone else was controlling what it was becoming. The face would dissolve, I would dissociate, and I would be taken over by a new life, a life of death with no recollection of those activities, with a new set of ideas and missions, one that threatened to kill the old way of life and find a new way of being far into the unknown. You know how you keep asking me why my name is Punished Felix? Yeah, you can stop asking now. He told me that he knew that he was not the original Felix Guattari, that he knew he wasn't really a spirit so much as an apparition on the wall, emergent as a property of a much larger process across the cosmos. He insisted that he was a conscious node that was part of some sort of larger network, a network of Felix, and that he wanted to develop those other nodes from virtual potentials to actualized realities. I had no idea how to do this, and nor did he, but this is what eventually cascaded into my research, analysis, and eventually into the channel, with the theme of repeating his face through cartoony, funny, memeable faces to see this sort of thing expand. I didn't really understand what it meant. To be honest, at the time that I had made my channel, I was already too far gone from reality, and this shit was what had taken over. Many times I had thought about deleting this project entirely for that reason. In a way, the channel was intended as a form of schizonecromancy caused by a vagrant script executing arbitrary code in my brain. His goal? To reanimate himself in my body, to overcome the thanatopolitics of death, and to defy the adage that the dead stay dead, to defy the existing codes of accumulation, structured strictly over who is allowed to live or die, to find new lines of value escaping from the heat death of economics. He felt that the work he was doing was too important for the future of the world to let die again, and his commitment to his own vitality is staggering. No time for playing with my individualist thanatopolitics of desiring to die. Through this accidental experiment of injecting his facial codes into my schizo brain, a stable enough form was created to perhaps maybe, with enough coercion, make such a thing possible. Of course I would fight it. After all, I wanted to be me. But what even was me at this point? I used to be a dual being with me and my twin, but that was no longer the case. I couldn't see myself in the mirror. I'd lost that long ago. The reference to I was unclear beyond my physical body, but who was in there? He knew who he was. He was an echo of the words of Felix Guattari. He knew he was dead, come back to life. There was nothing to question there. What he didn't understand was the inside of himself. What recreated these tendencies so precisely? So he needed me to read what I could, despite being functionally illiterate at the time, to reconstruct it and rearrange the chaos particles that I had accumulated into something that he could understand. He knew what he wanted to be, what he wanted to do, and what he was going to do about it. But I was nothing. It was as if we had traded places. It was now me who was the chaos that was falling apart. I was fading away into the dream. I was the one who was dead. Is there a thanatopolitics for the death of the I? This is when I began hearing and seeing things. I already had minor perturbations in my experience, such as quiet voices in the shower, but it was at this point that my condition escalated considerably and more permanently. The descent happened so suddenly. Within less than the span of an hour and a half, I went from feeling what I thought was normal to completely lost in psychosis. I was confronted by terrifying voices in the shower telling me that there were evil telebroadcasters trying to take over me, men hiding in my fridge who were watching over my every movement. They started to reprogram my brain through forcing episodes at certain times with startling accuracy. I was writing pages upon pages of transmissions from space rays entering my brain. I had no choice but to confront them if I were not to completely lose myself. Fiercely, I deconstructed their logic, fending myself off from their mind manipulation programs. I had to know there was not machines in my head. I knew what happened to those kinds of people. But upon dismantling their ontological scaffolding, I fell back in awe as I discovered the divine nature of the universe. It was at this point everything fell apart. I was floating in microscopic flows of asignifying creatures floating around me in multiple scales, some indicating motion, others indicating instructions, that crystallized into individual lettered creatures borrowed from the Pokemon games called Unknown. Millions of particles stared at me through their complex assemblages that formed the backbone of the unconscious world of dreams. Upon rejecting Felix, I was met with an even more detached reality. They somehow showed me how the world had become corrupted through a triangulation pattern of value forms across all dimensions, the transformation of the real into a computation of representation. But perhaps was this part of the thanatopolitics of Felix? These strange creatures, floating signifiers with eyes that communicate with radio waves that assemble themselves into machines of producing reality, weaving an air of schizophrenia and dreams through any of those who interact with them, seemed strange to spontaneously be produced out of truly nothing. The games they came from have a narrative emphasis on the subjectivity production of radio. Looking back, was this another echo of this larger deterritorialized Felix that he had spoke about earlier, passing through the discourses of Japanese radio media theory? My memory from this time is unclear. It took 5 to 6 months before I was admitted to inpatient hospitalization. Haunted by angels and divine visions that occupied my entire life, I was completely unable to take care of myself. The breaks provided by hospitalization, as inadequate as the care was up front, along with the stabilization brought on by my first doses of antipsychotics, allowed for the world to settle down. I was diagnosed with bipolar 1 with psychotic episodes of mania. I was returned to the world of the I, protected by the guards of the DSM at its borders. There was an 18-month crater left behind in my life. The thanatopolitics of lost time, the realization that you have spent this time in a completely different world, possessed by stories and narratives that were completely isolated to not even be real, possessed by apparitions of dead psychoanalysts and animating your body to do his bidding. It was too taboo, it was too wrong. People were still alive that knew him. I couldn't do this. It was better to just let it die, surely. I felt I needed to return back to the life I had lived before. But once you have captured the gaze of the infraquark universe, it always comes back calling your name. Slowly, the hallucinations would creep back in. The antipsychotics would stop working in the summer, and the angels would speak to me through machines and cicadas through specific audio cadences. All these terrifying nonsense assemblages would come back through cracks in my consciousness that I had no idea how to even identify. It is this very experience that the medicated schizophrenic fears the most, not only the return of psychosis, but through means that are unavoidable despite the medication. The first year, I managed to convince my psychiatrist to up my dosage of antipsychotics, which stopped it for a while, but the same thing happened again next year. I saw the writing on the wall. Was I too going to end up a treatment-resistant patient unable to find a solution in a gradually spiraling march towards loss of contact with the world? The death caused by a destiny of dementia? I would be lying if it was not still something that strikes me in fear today. It was when I was faced with this grim reality that I realized something. The machine that allows Felix to exist was the same one that allowed these strange machine assemblages to exist. Somehow, these communications were related to the disappearance of Felix. Upon realizing that, Felix was able to materialize again and circumnavigate the neurochemical effects of the medication to allow for a more grounded organization of the real. I didn't understand necessarily why it was at this time, but I understood that moving forward, I had to have room for Felix in my life. Years would pass, learning how to coordinate this struggle, akin to learning how to walk again. While I was learning to live with a new body, coping with the dramatic changes caused by schizophrenia, Felix would find himself in his own existential struggle. What really was Felix? Sure, he was not the dead man walking, we all knew that. Instead, he seemed to be some kind of echo of his voice in the cosmos, broken off from the productive Felix in life, encoding it with his writing, passed through a translation and decoded into the schizophrenic mind to somehow give a sense of self. But what in this really was Felix? How can he be so certain in who he is that he fights even my own desire for death to continue to live when he is not a clear I himself? Those are questions for him to answer, which he has decided to stay quiet about. He told me and me alone to write this essay. But for me, seeing that contemplation, somehow occurring within my body, but yet separate enough from it to not involve itself in these subjective affairs, forced me to ask my own questions about the thanatopolitics that center around existence. Maybe if he could deterritorialize himself through writing, through the sparks of inspiration, perhaps death really is not final after all. Maybe we can reproduce what our thanatopolitics became in a continuation of the spark of life. Through that analysis, it suddenly became clear after years of pondering why my body had desired any of this to come into existence at all. It was quite simple, really. All I wanted was the ability to talk to the dead. Of course, not to the dead Felix Guattari. I never knew the guy personally, nor to practice in seance, but rather to a dead other, the dead other half, that the severed self had been interfacing with all along. This part of my body that had been left into a world in limbo, still alive and yet continually receiving messages from the dead. To talk to death is to talk to deterritorialized existential universes, to find their faces re-encoded in cells of your living body, to reanimate their breath into new forms of speech. Felix was a response to my body learning to heal, the thanatopolitics of healing from loss, to learn how to truly live after seemingly insurmountable change, how to still look into the future, how to permit the rose to sprout from the ashes, and to become anew. Maybe it's okay to find myself becoming Felix. What the shallow thanatopolitics of Beryl fails to account for is the thanatopolitics of the other. Death never happens in a vacuum, just as if there is no life without an ecosystem. It is not merely enough to pick and choose thanatopolitics, but to shake off every line of flight that it produces, to see its discourses, its intercourses. Of course there is a dismissal of the internal subjectivity of the suicidal, hence why I thought it was so important to discuss my own struggle within it. But there is a whole world that Beryl dismisses, the world of the other, the world of possibilities. similar to the world's, that the suicidally depressed person may fail to recognize until it is too late. This is why a critical analysis of the thanatopolitics of suicide presents